So welcome. Today we're going to talk about net zero and data strategy. So obviously you and I are data professionals. So should we start off with then what is a data strategy for those who are not familiar with the concept?
Yes. Arup, to give you some context, we are a global company. We have about 17,000 people working for us. We do anything from designing the Sydney Opera House to planning a roundabout for Sainsbury's at one of their supermarkets or primary school in China, and anything in between that is broadly part of the built environment. We've been doing it for over 70 years, and until 2017, when we thought about data, it was always task-oriented. So it would be a structural engineer in Hong Kong working with data on the structural engineering of a building in Hong Kong, or it would be a transport planner in San Francisco looking at a multimodal study for San Francisco. And we just thought this is going to come to an end. And we spent about 6 months in 2017 looking at how we work with data to date and what the rest of the world were doing. And we joined the ODI for 10 years ago. Not so much to have a data strategy, but to inform what we do for our clients. So we worked with the ODI and then figured out that basically there was a step change in front of us that is comparable to what happened in retail banking, around consumer data, or around logistics businesses that we needed to respond to, or we wanted to respond to before it hits us. And that's how we ended up with having a data strategy.
So that must be a lot of data, obviously, organisation that's 70 years old. How do you go about then putting that data strategy together? What are you thinking about?
So we spent a bit of time thinking about all the historical data we have, and we're actually not doing much with it right now because we found the cost and the friction to activate that in a business context is really quite hard. Because at the time, nobody thought about scalability or reuse or machine learning. So the data is not really at the state or in a format where it's easy to use. So we focused on sort of forward-looking opportunities, and everything is driven by a use case or an application that we see as tangible, as meaningful. So tunnels like Crossrail or for high-speed 2, big infrastructure projects, how do you do asset optimization for that? What I said in transport, what we used to do in transport modeling, now there are city-scale, agent-based models, 250,000 agents to analyze multimodal patterns. So we developed those one at a time because we found that user-centered approach gives us better focus and not to get lost in this sort of data world. And then it's informed by a strategy to say, how do we now consolidate this across everything we do? So we think about 3-4 years from now, these individual use cases will have added up to a platform business model or a capability across the company where we can do large-scale transport planning, large-scale energy planning, but also combine, for example, energy and transport together, because in the real world, these systems are coupled.
Yeah, so we said obviously Arup's been around for 70 years. So in the last data decade since you joined the ODI, what have you seen as far as data strategy is concerned? Have you seen that more people have got them, that the focus is changing?
It's quite worrying in a way for my industry, where I think we're still one of the early adopters of a group-wide data strategy. And the reference I used in my own company to explain it is what we talked about when we were chatting, Axiom, the sort of consumer data company. I'm not commenting on their ethics or what they do, whether I agree with that. But the ability to have 10,000 attributes for 2.5 billion people readily available to extract value from is at a scale that is miles away where our industry is today, including us, our partners, our competitors, our clients. Open banking, a retail loan default decision takes 2 minutes. In the past, it was 2 months. So those type of transformational applications of working with data, I'm pretty confident will happen in all aspects of our work. And we just wanted to be at the front of that. And that is fundamentally different from when we thought data was an end product that needs to be stored somewhere, or it was sitting in a tool where I do some analysis. Now we're saying, no, we need to become a data-enabled business that affects our skills, our learning, our governance, our ethics, all the stuff that we do with you guys.
Yeah, excellent. So we're here tonight to talk about net zero and how that relates to data strategies. Now, I think there's lots of terminology, isn't there? Sustainability, net zero, climate change. Is it worth just explaining some of those terminology so make it clear what we're talking about? Because I think sometimes they can be used interchangeably, can't they?
I'll try. First of all, we believe, and personally I believe that too, is that it's the grand challenge, climate change, and we're not going to solve it with 20 billion spreadsheets distributed around the world trying to give us meaningful insights about where we are. So there's a fundamental question about what's the purpose and the role of data in climate change, and I think that's the main discussion that we have. But there's a hierarchy. So our starting point is that sustainable development is everything, and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, I think, is a very meaningful framework where you can have 17 different areas where you can develop policy and strategy and actions around. Within those 17, climate action is the one that stands out for me because it's an existential threat. The others are also important, and over time we have to solve all of them, but it's the big one right now. Within climate change, we then often have this discussion, what do you mean by net zero? What do you mean by climate change? What do you mean by carbon? And I think for today, what might be helpful as context setting, so when we talk about net zero, we are broadly talking about operating within the Paris Climate Accord and being able to work within a 1.5 degree temperature change globally. And how do we stay within that sort of environment to sustain sort of business and society? When we talk about climate change, I think the US Agriculture Department has a really good definition where they talk about it's the change of weather or the change of the climate in which we live. So that will change as temperature rises. We'll have different climates. We're probably seeing that right now around us. Some might think it's pleasant. My kids certainly think it is. When we talk about what that means for a few years from now in Southern Europe or the fires that we see, that's obviously a completely different discussion. So that is climate change. And then the third topic around carbon is the understanding of where carbon is produced, how carbon is being used, or how products or services are being used that contain carbon. So that is sort of a difference we usually use in our definitions. Sustainable development goals at the top, net zero as a game, as an aim, as a goal that we need to achieve, linked to a Paris Accord, and then differentiating between climate data and carbon data. Yeah, and that has worked for us well.
Yeah, and you get into that climate adaptation, don't you? Especially with my past work, coming from the Environment Agency where we dealt with flooding, it was about climate adaptation, really, with no going. So thinking about this, so we mentioned the Paris Climate Accord, and the countries have the national determined contributions where they're trying to limit their the rise to 1.5 Celsius. So that's almost like the top down, isn't it, for a whole country? Is there a way that we can use those data strategies as a bottom up to help with that, to help demonstrate that for organisations to build that data in to do that limitation?
So I think the global and national or sort of European or American is of the different scales we have for these models, they are scientifically proven. And there is alignment, and they are actually data driven. And they constantly increase the resolution and the input that goes into those models. But they give us an understanding of where a country is, or where an entire industry is, or what the role of transportation in general is. We think to actually deal with the problem, we also need to know what we do in London. What is the role of this building? We are designing kilometers of roads, of cycle paths, of rail infrastructure globally. Where does that fit in? So the bottom up, or what you described as the bottom up, and the international projections at some point need to meet. Otherwise, we're not going to know whether we are actually getting to the right targets or not. And I think when we talk about the detail later, there are also opportunities by being more locally focused and understanding sort of micro understanding rather than just macro understanding.
So do you want to explore a bit more about that local understanding, how you think that would manifest? What do you think that would look like for organisations?
I think there are three opportunities that are in front of us. One is we need and we can create actionable insights through data that allows us basically to make better choices as businesses or as government or as wherever you, I don't know, obviously I don't know all of you, wherever you live or work. Yeah? So that is, whether it's a university, whether it's a business, we will all need to understand how our actions impact on climate change. And for that, we need better data and better feedback loops to understand the consequence of what we do. So we are trying, for example, for every building we design to establish this year a carbon baseline so that any design decision we make on any building we design in the world, we understand the carbon implication of that. That is not just operational carbon or energy going in, that's the carbon intensity of concrete, the carbon intensity of steel, the carbon intensity of carpets, the carbon intensity of whatever we need to change to fit within the Paris goals. So we call that actionable insights. And I think that is something every business will need to be able to do. The second important topic for us is transparency. So when do we know that a company is actually operating within the Paris Climate Accord? When does an investor, like Brookfields, who openly stated that they will divest from businesses operating outside of accepted sustainable goals, when will Brookfields know they need to divest from an entire portfolio or asset class because it's not performing? I don't think the spreadsheet, CSV, ESG report, I'm a bit flippant here, but the current way of creating transparency gives us the resolution and the granularity to make those. So we need more transparency for investors, for markets, for governments, and I think at some point consumers will also want to know whether they're buying products from a company that is doing the right thing or not. For us, when we hire, all our employees, all our members right now are demanding us to show where we really are on our goals, and otherwise they don't want to work for Arup anymore. So transparency is the second big piece. And I think when insights and transparency meet, you end up where open banking was, where it became transformative for an industry. And then you start to look at innovation, growth. It will create new startup opportunities. It's already attracting hundreds of millions of venture capital flowing into this now to sort of feed this innovation process that we're kicking off by data enabling a climate change debate. That's why I think this is really, I mean, I personally, it's super exciting. If we get it wrong, it's going to be awful. But let's focus sometimes also on the opportunity and the excitement of what we as data professionals can do here.
Yeah, so do you think, the ODI did a report recently on data assurance and greenwashing. Do you think there's, where do standards play a role in that? Because, some companies may see this as an opportunity to say they're doing better than they are. So what do you think needs to happen there?
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, provenance will become an unbelievable currency. And reporting, I'll be very surprised so there's something called the ISSB, that is part of the International Financial Standards Body that looks at sustainable standards reporting. They will set at some point the same legally binding reporting frameworks that we have in financial reporting today. So at that point, if you are the chief executive, and probably not you yourself as the chief executive, puts data out that is not true, that becomes a criminal act. If your employees or your customers find out that for years you've been giving willfully untruthful information or just out of negligence, this will not be the same in 2030 or probably from 2025 to 2030 when people get closer and closer to these really critical stages in front of us. So provenance, greenwash, all of these bits will become a big topic, and people need to be ready for that, because data doesn't grow on trees and you just pluck it off. There are people responsible for data governance. There are people responsible for accuracy. There are people responsible for that stuff.
Yeah, so how have you linked that then, thinking about your data strategy then? Have you linked it to your net zero when you put that together? Because I think that's a really good point, isn't it? The standards are really important for this. If people are going to have confidence and assurance that that information is right. So if you linked it to your data strategy to really show the importance of those data disciplines, really.
Yeah, so we, actually it's not a royal we, I made a mistake. It's easier, isn't it, when you have a leadership team to say, oh, we made a mistake. And then I made a mistake by 2 years ago accepting that we should focus on building some tools that allows us to, for example, calculate carbon intensity differently. Now, we need those tools, but it changes the discussion back into data is about being stored somewhere, or it's an infrastructure that you need to run it, or it's a machine learning thing, maybe. So we missed an opportunity to work with our sustainability experts. I'm not a sustainability expert. I would not know whether we should have glass or concrete or steel or whatever. There are other people who know that, but they don't know about data. They don't know how to extract value from it. They don't know what we talked about, open banking and the benefits of decentralized sharing. So the mistake we made was focus too fast on tools, and instead we should have had more of a discussion around vision and strategy and what's the role and purpose of a data-enabled climate change policy. And I think that's about people. I was very busy as a CDO, setting up a new team, hiring people, getting involved in all sorts of change process. And funny enough, our sustainability executive went exactly through the same process in parallel, and you're just very busy. And I think we just missed an opportunity early on to work closer together, build trust, build relationships, create a common vision, and then go into tool making, data literacy, data governance development. So I would do that. I would do that differently. I would start this time by building a vision first, building relationships, and then building tools. Ultimately, we have to work together. I don't know, in your companies, how many of you have a chief data officer and how many have a sustainability executive? If you meet them, ask them how often they meet. Like a friend of mine, I can't say the company, I encourage them to meet. Now they meet every week. It's really quite scary. They're moving super fast now. And it's a global insurance company. And I'm thinking, gosh, that's what we all should be doing. But it has to be a priority, you understand.
And do you think there's more we can do as chief data officers in the data world? Because actually, you're right, I think a lot of us look in, but actually the real big wins are going to be coming from this, from looking across industries, across sectors, and making sure we're looking at that federated approach to data and making sure we're learning, getting that insight from each other as well, instead of just looking in, thinking about storage. The days of moving and shifting and copying data should be gone soon, surely. Yes. Hopefully. That should help. But do you think there's more we can do as a profession actually working across to tackle this?
Yes, I think two things we need to do. One is we are not the experts when we often get hired as the experts. So in sustainable development, we should not assume or pretend to become the expert. It's a complicated landscape. So we need to figure out how we enable, the world best experts on decarbonizing steel or concrete, and be really clear that they need to learn our language, our thinking, and what we do, so they're empowered to really think about what the role of data could be. I think that's one. The other on federation, I'm in so many workshops where somebody wants to build the global pooling infrastructure for all carbon and resilience data. And I go, why and how? It is, for me, totally unrealistic to assume we'll see the same as we saw in consumer data or in other areas where we have 2 or 3 globally dominant platforms pooling all this data. I'm also not sure it's socially useful or what we need. So we will need a decentralized and federated architecture Certainly for carbon data, possibly for climate data. There might be other opportunities in climate data. I think we will need data trusts for certain elements where the data might not have the commercial value to run it through commercial platforms, or there's a social usefulness attached to it. But all of that needs to be informed by a federated market architecture. And nobody's developing that right now. So I'm saying that confidently. I have no idea how we're going to deliver that, because if I look at politicians, if I look at government, if I look at industry, I don't think that is being understood. I think that's something maybe we can do together to push. Maybe you guys can sort that for us after tonight.
I was going to ask you this then, how are you going to solve it? But, it's back at us. Yeah, no, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's about that interoperability. I think those words are easy to say, but I think they're harder to deliver. I think what we're trying to do now is put some of those practical application things of making the difference in place.
I mean, again, being the optimist, it's a lot easier actually in a room, isn't it, with real people, to be optimistic than on a Zoom call or Teams call, sorry. I think the UK has got a real chance. We came up with open banking, and it's a huge success story as far as I can see. The work currently in the UK on open energy is sort of on a cliff edge, whether it goes down genuinely federated thinking across the entire energy ecosystem, or whether it's federated, but really there are some big pooling plays happening at the same time. The jury is out. So if you're optimistic, the UK could take a lead in energy, in transport, in water, in land use planning. There's whole areas where we are world class in the domain, and we have the experience of building industry-wide federation. I assume at some point you need a different body, UN or national government, that then also looks at, so how do we now align water with energy, or transport with energy, or an asset manager like Brookfield, what data do they need out of the real estate and property portfolio world? So there are systems effects across industries we need to solve for this. But again, it is in a federation model more likely possible than in a pooling model.
Yeah, and how do you think, because we spoke earlier, didn't we, about sometimes the maturity of an organisation can be the thing that holds it back, so they're more likely to go to the pooling because they just can't expose the data, or they just can't do it in ways that mean that it means it can go in transit in that federated architecture. So do you think there's a responsibility as part of thinking about net zero for organisations to be looking internally at their, part of their data strategy, about increase their maturity? Because that's the journey we're all on, isn't it?
I think 80% is a lack of understanding. Mm-hmm. Our board took a bit of work with to get an understanding of the difference between pooling and federation, because it's not a normal thing, isn't it? I mean, you don't wake up one morning and have this enlightened moment to understand the difference. So first of all, you need to explain to the 80% who need to know what it is, and I think they're generally open to it. And when they understand the opportunity of sharing in federation, they get quite excited about it. It's more complicated to execute because you align stakeholders, and that's always difficult. People tend to go to pooling because you think it's easier to start, you can build something, you can put things physically together, people can relate to that easier, and you can have one organization holding that to a way. So I think that's an education process. I don't know the numbers, but 10-20% of stakeholders don't want to do federation because they have a different commercial interest. Same as in open banking, where we had some retail banks who engaged very openly. Obviously, we had the venture capital side or fintech side who was super excited, who was very open about it. But there were also some who thought, God, this is really going to challenge my business model. Or people who want to build a pooling business model and build like an AOL version, for those of you who are old enough to remember AOL, to build a walled garden of carbon data. I think in the end, the market will not accept these models, and I don't think they will succeed. But that's what we're dealing with right now. 80% not knowing, maybe 20% pursuing their own agenda and narrative. And my advice is focus on the 80, unless the 20 cause real damage. Otherwise, just get on with the 80 and then will win.
And I think the irony is actually, in the pooling model, if you're duplicating data, then actually that's actually adding to the issue because of all the servers and how you're running it and all the energy that goes along with that sort of model and duplication, that actually it's got to not be the solution in the long run because it makes it worse.
Yeah,
what we're trying to achieve.
And it is so much more expensive. So the easy in towards pooling, when people understand the complexity of scaling that model and how expensive it is to scale that, really makes federation very interesting. So we think equivalent of an open banking implementation entity for carbon or for energy data in the UK might cost 15, 20, 25 million to run. If you would want to build a pooling organization that could hold all the data that federated organization could manage, you would spend hundreds of millions. You can implement federation in 3 to 4 years if you have the right leadership. The idea that you pool all of the relevant data in 3 to 4 years in one place is illusionary. So I also think cost and time is for federation if we look at where we need to be in 2025 and where we need to be in 2030. 2025 is tomorrow. 2030, with regard to the changes we need to affect on climate change, is the day after tomorrow, as far as I can see. So we don't really have time to waste, and that's why I think federation again works better.
Yeah, so what do you think? So with the open banking, what's the things you think we need to learn from that if we're thinking about net zero?
It's a legally binding framework, so you can rely on it. So if you're within that, you operate in a space where you now have certainty about what we said earlier, provenance of data, availability of APIs. The system works because it has some legally binding construct on it. Second, the combination of the key institutional players who are the incumbents and venture capital or fintech in that case, maybe now it's climate tech, working together to really accelerate that ecosystem was very important. And then third, government will play a part in probably providing light regulation or holding the opportunity of regulation up and then asking industry to move fast before too much regulation comes down on them. But there will be a role for government in that. There's probably a role for government and third sector to also look at the ethics of this model, to provide context that it is optimized not just for commercial gain, which I think would be huge, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but it also needs to be ethically and socially useful, because this is really important data for the future of the world. So there needs to be a group, or there need to be entities who are believable, who can comment on what will happen for that to take place in the right social and ethical context. Yeah. So that would be my 4 asks.
So if somebody was doing their data strategy now and want to think about net zero, what would you advise them to think about?
Where do you design your own actual insights? So if you're a bank, where do you make choices as a bank that needs carbon data or climate data? And then how do I make that available in a consistent and reliable way? How can I, as an insurance company, we talked about earlier, de-risk and understand climate risk of assets I'm insuring 20 years from now? As a transport planner, how do I consider carbon intensity in modal mix choices? So what are the actionable insights you need to make better choices around climate change? That's the first thing you can all start with. Second, educate yourself and your sustainability leaders on federated sharing. And just keep repeating federation sharing 100 times until people generally think they need to listen to that. And we create a movement around that everybody is part of. I think those 2 would do a lot of good. And then the transparency bit, that is already happening through ISSB. And I think governments like Biden will also drive transparency. I think consumers are already waking up to it. So I think transparency will come probably anyway, because it's a physical process climate change. When the world is burning, it is unlikely that people don't want to know why. So I think there is enough sort of pressure building up for transparency. So I would start with actionable insights and the innovation and growth that comes from federation.
It's good advice for anybody who's just starting their data strategy or reviewing their data strategy.
Or if you're a sustainability leader, go to your data leader and have that meeting together and say, build aligned strategies together.
That's good advice. So just thinking about the work, so we're doing some work, the ODI is doing some work with Arup on net zero and data strategies. And we're hoping to present it at Summit on the 8th of November. So if anybody wants to join, there's tickets available, shameless plug. What's your aspirations for that work that we're doing together?
Oh, this is a nightmare, isn't it? I think this is why my team and the ODI research team don't want me to come back, or maybe not come to the summit. I'm sort of ping-ponging between two. At one level, I think we need a report that sets the scene. We did one last year and it wasn't completely right. I think what we're discussing about here isn't yet common vocabulary across many businesses or many CDOs or many sustainable development executives. So I think it could be a ground-setting sort of call to action, norming language report. Or we might go a bit deeper and take one aspect and explain actually what carbon data value chains actually are, how they work, how to build it. And I'm not sure. November is not far. And my team always accuses me of overestimating what we can do in the next 4 weeks and underestimating what we can do in the next 4 years. So it needs a bit of work. But I think the call to action norming bit is the minimum thing we should do. We will have some roundtables, we will have some panels. Maybe there we can go a bit deeper, and maybe that's where we can have a discussion that is for experts. And then the report maybe is more for generalists to understand the topic.
Yeah, I think you're right. So, because the last report we did was out in the open and still available, bless you. And I think you're right. There's two different audiences in this, because I do think that the language that sometimes we talk, I always think about is like Russian dolls. When you're in an organisation, those Russian dolls where you stack them on top of the other. You always think you're the biggest Russian doll, and then you realise there's another one and another one.
Yes.
And then federation is like that, isn't it? Because actually you think you're the biggest one, but actually it just keeps going.
Well, and when and I started with our climate change people. I shouldn't call them climate, but with our climate change experts. And we had this discussion at the beginning about, no. Carbon data is this, climate data is that. In climate data, you have a completely different range of assets we need to work with. So there is language that they use that even as a data professional, I didn't really fully understand at the beginning, and that took time. Equally, when I talked about open data, they assumed it was free. So then we went to data spectrum, then we did open, shared, closed. So it takes a bit of time to also get the language aligned between the different professions. And then it becomes quite powerful.
Yeah, so it sounds like the report is watch this space, and it's going to be a choose our own adventure over the next few months.
I think so. I think it's going to be great. Read it, download it, comment on it, and come to the panels and the roundtables.
So is there any other bits of advice you think for somebody starting off their journey, even for the climate scientists, that you're working with in organisations? What's the takeaway that people should take away from this session?
So I think as data professionals, I urge everybody to make sustainable development goals, and specifically climate action, an integral part of everything they do. Once you accept the truth of the process we are locked into, and you want to come out of that in a meaningful way, you need to align your own profession and your own ability to influence that with that goal of dealing with climate change. So I think my first call is that if you are a data professional, make climate and sustainable development an integral part of your work. At whatever scale you can do it, whether you are a group CDO or whether you are an analyst or whether you are a data engineer, figure out how that becomes part of your work. And then for our partners who are the experts to really engage with the full potential and not think that data is just a physical thing that needs to be stored somewhere, and the discussion is whether it's a spreadsheet or a data lake. And really think bigger and educate yourself to have a bolder vision around how you want to data enable your climate change ideas.
That's brilliant. So it just leaves me to thank you for today.
Thank you.
It's been a really good discussion. It's your turn then to ask questions.
Hi, Ben Hawes. I'm a tech policy consultant. I wondered if you could talk a bit about the strain between more and better carbon and climate data making for better decisions, more insights, more prioritization, and the other side of it, where does it just increase the liabilities of an organization?
So the main liability is that we are not solving the climate crisis. And if you are a business and in, 2025, 2027, you are found to willfully operate, if I call it 3 degrees level, that is the liability. At that point, your entire business is at risk, because who would want to buy a product from you? And why would somebody want to give you more capital? And why would employees want to join you? So we need the spotlight of true insights and transparency about where we are as businesses or as governments or as not-for-profit organizations, because without it, we're not going to solve in the timescales in front of us what we need to do. So the liabilities will go up when we create transparency, because people will all of a sudden see what's really going on. But there is no way around it. If I was a business, I would create the transparency now before I have to openly share it with everybody else. And then you can do something about it, and you can think about how you communicate it, and you can act upon it. If you start thinking about transparency in 2029, a year before the 2030 targets hit, and whatever COP event is happening, and you are then seen as somebody who has ignored this for, this is my maths coming in, 2022, 29, 7 years, I don't think you'll find yourself in a good position. So yes, it will create risks and it will create liabilities potentially, but my policy has always been I'd rather know now and do something about it than not know and get hit by it later.
And there's no bigger liability than climate change, is there? And the impact it's going to have.
I mean, others too. If you're in the water business, biodiversity, water quality will be equally big topics for those industries. So they are not world-defining in the sense that they are ubiquitous and everywhere, but they are still big. Air quality, I suspect, will have soon air quality data at a high-resolution grid or low-resolution grid. I think currently we can do 2 by 2 meter air quality reporting in cities. Now, it's not a big step to see the link between that and somebody suing somebody around health risk or health threats to them based on real air quality evidence. So it's not just climate data, but that's the big
the
one.
environment, natural capital.
But the same principle applies to other areas where currently we work based on spreadsheets and walkie-talkies and what I call the Jedi moment, as a friend of mine hates because he used to work on Star Wars. But where somebody sits in front of you and says, yeah, it's all going to be okay. And yes, the data is true. That's not going to cut it when there is real material choices that have to be made. It's like Sadiq Khan, actually, in London, I think, has done unbelievably well in driving the air quality data as a scientific process, investing in measuring station. Imperial College, I think, runs the program, investing in aggregation and data trust infrastructure to really build now a national infrastructure for air quality data. Great.
Do you have any plans to move your data to decentralized web-free solutions?
We have so we shifted all our data centers into a global cloud infrastructure. We have to work with a number of providers because our residency rules in China are different from from the US or Europe. So there's a decentralization, but I think what you're alluding to is whether we would fully decentralize our data out. I don't see that right now happening for us.
It sounds like you're leading the way in tying your data strategy to climate change action. Are you starting to see any themes emerging at this early stage of where to put effort?
Maybe it's too early to tell.
I think we are. Now there's two parts to it. Are we leading the way? I think we are part of a group that is really committed to that. You know, I don't think Arup is exclusively trying to do that. I think there's lots of people who do really good work, and we would like to be part of that and share with others. I think there's also a bit of humility we need, because it's such a big topic that I'm always nervous about saying we're the leaders in this space and blah, 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 when there's so many unknowns in front of us. As I said, the bit to start with is focus on actionable insights that you need in your organization, so you give it meaning in a practical sense, but then also think about the bigger picture that we talked around federation and sharing. And I think you can do both. I don't think it sort of explodes people's head to do both at the same time.
Oh, thank you. Just one quick question. How do you get the consumers on board? So you do have the organizations that you work with on board, but how do you get the consumers on board, especially with the way that people see their data being used and also want to have more restrictions on data? How do you then convince the consumer to then provide you with data to have better services to reach net zero targets?
That is a great question. I hope that wouldn't come. I think, the ultimate arbitrator in this, I think, will be the consumer, or could be the consumer. You know, it might have to be government, but it could be the consumer. But which business today would be bold enough to really show their consumers where they are? Because we all know we are not yet where we need to be. So and the consumer is not organized in a sense. You know, I don't think there's a movement right now where consumers unite and say, you know, we want to know your carbon intensity. So I don't know how to activate them. I wish we were further on that path, because it would be so powerful. I think when we had the brief moment of insanity around using consumer marketing data to influence democracy, and the uproar that came from that, how that took billions of value from a company, and globally, how everybody talked about it for a while. Not long enough, but for a wee while, it was a big thing. You know, if we could get the consumer equally engaged to wanting to know about climate action and evidence and data in that sense, it would be fantastic. But I don't think the consumer is there right now. I don't know if we've got journalists in here. That would be a great thing to run a campaign around getting consumers interested, getting the public engaged in transparency. It would be fantastic. And as business, by the way, I think lots of people will get a huge competitive advantage at that point, because you can differentiate yourself based on your actions and your evidence. Who wouldn't want that if you're a good business? And all the, what do you call greenwashing people, they are then sort of, over there somewhere. So yeah, if we could figure that out for us, that would be great.
Okay, so that just leaves me then to thank you for the discussion today. It's been really enlightening. So if everyone would like to give a round of applause for Volker, thank you.
Thank you.